Do you feel you have equitable access to accessible parking in British Columbia? Join us on December 3rd, 2021 from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for our next Accessible Community Forum and help us explore possible solutions and resources to bridge the gap between the accessible parking you currently experience and what it could become. Presented by the Disability Foundation and co-hosted with the Connector Society and the Social Planning and Research Institute of British Columbia, this event takes place on Zoom and is an open, honest, and inclusive dialogue between a panel of organizational representatives and our beautiful province's diverse disability community. Register today and help inform the conversation by taking our survey at acfparking.eventbrite.ca. Hello, and welcome to Discover Stories on Reimagine Radio. My name is Sean Burdett, an intern with the Vancouver Adapted Music Society. Today we have Dave Willows on the show. Dave is the founder of Accessible Parking BC, a consulting organization for accessible parking bylaws and infrastructure in the BC area. Dave, thank you so much for coming on today. How's it going?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Anytime. So just starting off here, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I live over in the Capital Regional District in a rural community called Brentwood Bay. We're a family of four, and I've got an 8-year-old son who has cerebral palsy and uses a wheelchair. So we've got a van that's adapted to support him. We're using a hoist van right now, but down the road we're going to be looking at a ramp van. And that's kind of how I got into the whole disability or accessibility advocacy role. By trade, I'm actually a sailor. I used to work in West Africa, and for about 10 years, I was a chief officer and captain of BC Ferries. And now my primary role is as a marine pilot. So I bring the deep sea ships into ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert. And through that, it's a highly regulated industry. So that's kind of what drew me towards accessibility standards and guidelines.
Wow, you've lived an exciting life.
Seen a few things.
Yeah, I can imagine. So tell us more about Accessible Parking BC. How did it get started?
Yeah, so in 2018 was sort of when we first started to notice how much the accessible parking was going to be a part of our lives, having a child with disabilities. And I was really frustrated by the amount of misuse and abuse of it in town. So I happened to reach out to the director of parking at the City of Victoria, just curious to see how often do they actually enforce it? How many fines and tickets do they issue in a year? And an offhand comment in the response that came back was that they were looking at phasing out the on-street designated accessible parking in the city because it was underutilized and providing some free time at 20-minute meters and that. So I was curious, why is it being underutilized? Because I know that there's a lot of people with accessible parking permits in the region. So I went out and I did a report. I walked downtown. I used the information from the City of Victoria that they provided to say where their accessible parking was. And I was kind of concerned with what I found. A lot of the on-street parking either wasn't on the map or didn't exist anymore. And a number of the spaces, probably about half of them, had significant barriers to access. Things as simple as having Canada Post letter boxes right next to the curb, or no curb ramp in that. So there was problems with the design, and part of that report too was to highlight to the City of Victoria ways that they could very quickly and cost effectively adapt that parking and make it more usable for the people that need it.
Could you tell us a little bit more about just sort of like what you found in this report and on top of what you mentioned before?
Yeah, so design was a very significant issue. Information has also been an issue. Like I said, the map that was provided by the city at the time showed a number of parking spaces that didn't exist, and even more have been removed since. These are important ones too. That were places like the downtown entertainment district next to the Ministry of Health building, and that kind of what I started to see too is some of these spaces that had disappeared, especially more recently, have been some of the challenges that we've been facing between competing interests with climate action and active transportation plans and the need for accessible parking. One of the things that I find is that most people don't recognize that for many people with disabilities, a car or a van is actually a large mobility device. When you look at places like Stanley Park and Beacon Hill Park in Victoria, there's a lot of, especially seniors, and that can't, they just don't have the mobility to be able to get out and enjoy the park in these places, other than from a vehicle, or can only wander a very short distance from it. Um, so there's a need to sort of shift that mindset. And so with that report, there was, apart from the spaces that didn't exist, there was also problems with abuse of the parking spaces. A number of them weren't available because there were people there without accessible parking permits. A number of them were closed for construction, and so the whole idea of reliability, of availability of accessible parking in downtown Victoria was a real challenge. Um, there was also confusion around the signage. It wasn't clear, and a lot of people felt that maybe they had to pay just using coins in the meter, when in fact you could use the Park Victoria app to pay for parking. So there was a lot of misinformation, communication issues in that, as well as the physical design. And the intent of that report was to highlight it for the city and, like I say, provide some quick, easy fixes that would get that parking to a state where it was more usable until a long-term plan could be developed for accessible parking through the city.
What sort of solutions did you propose in this report?
A lot of them are really simple. Like I say, there was one that was literally as simple as calling Canada Post and asking them to move two letterboxes that would have blocked the curbside access for someone trying to get out of a side door of a van. Others, it was simply moving a parking space a couple stalls to take advantage of an existing driveway for a curb ramp. Or to move away from a place where there was a barrier. There's some that had lamp posts in the middle of the parking space. So it was a lot of very simple things. There was very few that actually needed any actual capital works to be able to provide parking in that area.
You made this report public. How did the city of Victoria respond to this?
Um, they responded positively, took it under advisement. There hasn't really been much happen on it since 2018. It's kind of unfortunate. The city of Victoria started down the path of developing accessible parking standards last year, but it kind of fell by the wayside. They don't actually have any requirements right now for accessible parking in any new developments. The city has a guideline that's not published that they're kind of applying to new public parking. And you'll see that along Dallas Road at Clover Point and in Beacon Hill Park. But it hasn't managed to make its way into the city's parkades yet, or to any of the on-street parking, and certainly not to new developments.
What would you want to see from the city of Victoria in terms of improving the whole accessible parking situation?
Well, let's start with the parkades. That gives us a central location to be able to go from. But one of the challenges too is the eligibility criteria for an accessible parking permit. One of the conditions is that walking 100 meters can cause you medical distress. So we need to also have it dispersed not just in the parkades but throughout the area. The City of Victoria does offer an extra hour of free on-street parking at meters that are 90 minutes or more. But if you find a spot that works for you and you've got to go and move your car after 2.5 hours because you're doing, multiple things downtown, that's time. But also you might not find another suitable spot in the area. So there's all these sort of things that are balancing and again, we're still coming back to design issues.
Do you have any sort of recommendations in terms of the design issues and?
Yeah. Absolutely. I was very fortunate to be able to do some work earlier this year with the Social Planning and Research Council of BC in conjunction with the City of Vancouver and a number of other disability organizations. And what we did was a design charrette. There's a number of different accessibility standards and designs across North America. We've got our Canadian Standards Association Accessibility Standard Design. We've got the Access for Ontarians with Disabilities Act design and some others that are sort of in between. And what we did was at a recreation center in Vancouver, marked out the dimensions of these different accessible parking spaces and invited people to come down with their adapted vehicles and try them out and see what works. And it was interesting. I have worked with municipalities where we've used the CSA standard before. It's a little bit narrower. It's only 4.6 meters wide, and the finding was if you're using a side access ramp, that's a little bit tight, especially if you're up against another vehicle or a wall. The Access for Ontarians with Disabilities Act standard, it's a little more complicated because it's two sizes of parking spaces. There's a van size space and a standard car sized accessible parking space. But that extra little bit of width for the van made a huge difference for people's ability to safely get in and out of their vehicles.
Hmm. And in terms of these standards, like, what is there one that you would prefer that they implement, or do you think that like there's issues with all of them and that we need to make improvements on top of them?
Well, I'll back it up a little bit here. So right now in the province of British Columbia, there are no standards, no provincial standards for accessible parking. In December
Okay.
of 2018, the province removed accessible parking from the building code. Admittedly, it was a very poor standard. It hadn't changed since it was first introduced in 1965. But these are most of the sort of standard 3.7 meter wide parking spaces you'll see out in the community today. Um, but in doing that, they left about a third of the communities across BC with no requirements for parking for people with disabilities in any new developments. A lot of developers and communities have kind of adopted the old BC Building Code standard, but it does not accommodate the needs of a lot of people who have adapted vehicles, particularly those with side access vans. What I would love to see is with the regulations under the BC Accessibility Act is the province adopt the Ontario standard with the two types of parking spaces. And the nice thing about that standard is not only does it have the two sizes of spaces, but it also gives you a ratio. It's one van space and one car space alternating. And it also gives you a percentage. It's about 4% of all parking would need to be accessible in new developments. And that seems to be consistent when you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act and other actual accessibility standards.
What would you say would be the first step in terms of like in terms of implementing this Ontario standard over in BC?
Um, I'm hoping that with the consultations that are starting, that we can get something in there. Um, what's what we've been left to do is advocate on a municipality by municipality basis. And there's, I believe, about 168 municipalities across BC, not including regional districts. So I got started here in Victoria with a colleague, and we worked with the three municipalities on the Saanich Peninsula. And all three have adopted new accessible parking standards that include van accessible parking and a higher percentage, recognizing that our demographics are changing. We've got about one in 4 to 1 in 5 Canadians has a disability or medical condition that impacts their daily activities. And when you get to some communities like Sydney, for example, on the peninsula, about 40% of their population is over the age of 65. So now you're starting to deal with a lot of age-related mobility challenges. So again, a higher percentage of accessible parking is required. The other piece that goes with that is with the focus now on green transportation and trying to move people out of vehicles. We're seeing a lot of variances in new developments. In fact, the city of Victoria is proposing developments with no parking at all. So using a percentage is at times a challenge. And you need that percentage to be higher because, again, for a lot of people with disabilities, the transit system may not work. HandyDart is badly oversubscribed and can be a challenge to get a ride. If you're a family like mine who has a young child, we don't have a lot of options. My wife and I both work. We need to be able to pick my son up from school, get him to his specialist appointments or therapies and that. And there just simply isn't transit that's available to do that. So these again, it's these competing priorities of green transportation and accessibility, and recognizing that there is a place for both. It just needs to be factored in as we make these changes.
Going back to something you mentioned earlier, you said that just given the state of the bylaws, it's left you to have to go to each of the different municipalities and sort of advocate, like on a one by one basis. What has that process looked like for you?
Um, it's been different depending on the community. Again, here on the Saanich Peninsula, the local governments have been incredibly welcoming, both the staff and the elected officials. Some of the other communities have been a bit more of a challenge. I find that some of the larger communities here in Victoria, rather than best practices, they start looking at averages. What are other communities doing? So rather than when they're building a bike lane, they're going for the gold standard. But it seems when it comes to accessible parking, and I don't know if this is that concept of the war on cars, but accessible parking seems to sort of be downgraded. So it's not always a positive experience.
I see. And I'm sure, given your line of work, you've become quite familiar with the accessible parking bylaws. And what are some of the common shortcomings or areas that you would like to see some improvement in that you've noticed across these bylaws?
Um, well, first off, we still got a number of communities that don't even have bylaws, and there's also two aspects to it. There's the requirement to have the accessible parking and what that parking looks like. As we're advocating across different communities, and there's organizations such as the South Fraser Active Living Group and Vince Neal that are doing amazing work in the Lower Mainland as well. We're looking for consistent signage, and that's signage that comes from the Motor Vehicle Act regulations. We're looking for consistent dimensions, so that people with disabilities and their family and their friends, when they go out, they have a degree of assurance that, yeah, the parking is actually going to work for us. We're looking for consistency in the supply rates. Some of the challenges, there's a lot of close enough when it comes to accessible parking. Oh, it's only 10 centimeters too narrow. Oh, do you really need the sign? And actually, signage is in some cases has become a real issue. I don't know how many times I've gone to malls or even my son's school after a snowfall, and with no signs, the snow clearing crews have no idea where the accessible parking is, and often it seems to be a convenient place to pile the snow. So now those parking spaces are not available for 4 weeks. So all these sort of pieces come together, but again, it's a consistency issue. You'll go to one municipality where they say that you have to have a parking space that's clearly marked for people with disabilities and 3.7 meters wide, and that's it. And you go to the next municipality, and it'll have a full description of the signage, of the dimensions, have van and car parking, and even maybe get into the accessible path to get to the building, because that's another challenge that we see often with design, is it's poorly implemented. So you got a place to park, but there's not a safe path to get to where you're trying to go.
I really liked how you phrased it earlier, this close enough sort of paradigm with it. Why do you think that is?
I think that most people that end up with close enough don't really appreciate just how important those extra few centimeters are. It's the same idea as the person that pulls into an accessible parking space without a permit because they're just going to be a minute, or I'm just picking something up, and for people with disabilities, there often isn't an alternative. I have a friend who uses a side access ramp van, and had to take her mother to a local healthcare facility, and they had to cancel their appointment because the parking wasn't suitable. And it was a temporary change because tents were set up for COVID testing. It's an important thing that needs to be done. But when a lot of these accommodations or changes are made, the actual requirements aren't captured. And this has actually been one of the challenges through the pandemic is, these patios and that are opening up outside are great, give us the opportunity to get out and support our local businesses. But too often we're seeing that they're using the accessible parking for part of that service area because it's convenient, it's close to the door, without realizing the impact it has.